Perfect. And I'm live. All right. Hi guys. Good to see you. I'm here to talk today about poisonous Victoriana. Uh, so, you're thinking probably I'm going to talk a lot about poisoners because serial killers are my thing, and you know that. But that's actually not going to be the main focus, believe it or not, because in the Victorian era, poison was literally everywhere. You could not escape it. So you didn't need to be poisoned by a person in order to be poisoned in the Victorian era. And it was actually really kind of interesting. So I have prepared a nice little visual aid for us, and I have found a lot of cool pictures. So we'll go through it. And I am going to kind of go through it quick because it's a lot of information and I only have 45 minutes. So I will, however, bring up the chat, which give me a second and I'll do that. So you can put questions in it. All right, let's do this. Poison. Short history. Poisons were discovered by ancient man. When I say ancient man, I mean like cavemen. But the thing is, back then, we didn't so much have the conflict between humans. We actually worked a lot more together. We think of ancient man and cavemen as like these savages, brutal, but no, they had to work together in order to survive. So these guys discovered poisons through observations of the effects of various plants. So, like, if Ugg over there ate those berries and then started puking his guts out and died, you know those berries probably have some bad stuff going on with them, right? You know, it's kind of not odd. It's not rocket science even for a caveman. So they would learn to cultivate these plants eventually, and they would rub them on weaponry like the arrowheads and the spears so that it would help them bring down large prey faster. Again, it was all about survival in the early days. It wasn't it wasn't until we learned to settle down, farm, create civilizations that our true human nature came out and we started killing each other because it's what we do, right? So our first records of using poisons against each other is the first records that we have. Ancient civilizations, Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, Rome. Nobility loved poisons because it seemed beneath a nobleman, royalty, what have you, to actually like get into a fist fight or pick up a weapon against another person or much less a family member. But you stick a little bit of poison in their food and they're dead and not a threat to your throne anymore. And how they die, it's a mystery. We'll never know. So poison was very popular among nobility. We tend to associate ancient Greeks with poison because of the very infamous case of Socrates. We know that he drank hemlock when he was sentenced to death. We'll get into a little bit about hemlock. I will go into specifics about poisons. His last words, I have to include these because they were some of the most badass last words. He gave 0 Fs about his fate. 0. His last words were telling one of his supporters that was there like to support him as he died, Crito, I owe the sacrifice of a rooster to I can't pronounce that name. I'm not great with Greek names, but it was a minor god. He goes, will you pay that debt to me and not neglect to do so? Like, no big deal. Oh, right. I forgot to sacrifice that rooster this morning. Hey, can you do that as he's dying? Badass. Another Greek figure that I wanted to mention is Mithridates. He's cool. He is known as the Poison King because he was so paranoid about being poisoned that he decided to build up an immunity to poison by taking poison every single day in minute amounts. It's totally the Princess Bride scene where he builds up the immunity to iocane poisoning, and I just think that that's really cool. So yeah, Mithridates, the Poison King. Anyway, that's a little bit of history of poison. So where does poison come from? What is poison? By definition, any substance that's capable of causing damage to living tissue can be ingested, it can be inhaled, it can be absorbed through the skin, it can be injected. But And I need to stress this, dosage is ultimately what defines a poison. Things that we think of as utterly toxic, things like heavy metals, like gold, they're even used in medicine today in minute amounts. So gold is used to treat rheumatoid arthritis. But something that we need to survive, water, we're made 80% of water. But if you drink, an average sized person drinks 6 liters of water in one sitting, you will die. Dosage is what makes something a poison. 4 major sources of poisons at this time. Microbial. People don't usually think of microbial as a source of poison. By definition, though, it's causing damage to living tissue. Therefore, fungi, bacteria, parasites, other microorganisms, if they're damaging your tissue, that is technically a form of poison. Animal poisonings would be your stings, your bites, venoms, other things like that, including allergic reactions. So if you get stung by a bee and have anaphylactic shock, that's death by poisoning. Plant poisons, these are we're starting to now get into the ones that people tend to associate with the word poison. So one of the most commonly associated poison sources, reactions can be mild and topical. Poison ivy, for instance. I'm not talking about Christina, I mean the actual plant. Poison ivy, whereas they can also be fatal. You know, we know the deadly ones, like we just talked a little bit about hemlock. And then we have our synthetic or metalloid poisons. These are the ones that the Victorian era just freaking loved because they were discovered pretty much all in the 19th century. That's when your chemists were starting to get creative. They were refining metals, harnessing their properties. And since then, at the very end of the Victorian era, actually more into the 20th century, we have added another category, radiation. Thank you to the Curies for giving us that one, because we just love figuring out other things that we can poison our bodies with. That's what we do. All right, poisonous effects. 3 broad categories. You got your neurotoxins, your cytotoxins, and your hemotoxins. Pretty obvious what they do. Neurotoxins affect your brain. Cytotoxins kill off living cells, and they can be general cytotoxins, which affect all the cells throughout the body, or they can be specific cytotoxins. For instance, you've got hepotoxins. Hepotoxins focus on your gastrointestinal tract. You got cardiotoxins. They affect your heart and your cardiovascular system. And, of course, hemotoxins, they destroy your red blood cells. All of these toxins can be deadly, but neurotoxins tend to be the most severe because your brain it runs everything. It's the computer that runs the whole system. If the computer goes down, you're screwed. So neurotoxins tend to be the worst. All right, now let's get into the actual categories. Poisonings. So we're specifying Victorian England here. When you talk about Victorian, well, it's Queen Victoria. So England is what we're focusing on. We're not talking about Australia. I only have 45 minutes, guys. And if I were to get into all of the 8 poisonous animals in the UK, we'd have to include Australia. And I just don't have the time for that. So England, they don't really have any spiders that are particularly dangerous. They do have one dangerous snake, the adder. They also have yellow-tailed scorpions, a wide variety of wasps and hornets, which we talked about allergies. But since we're talking Victorian era, interesting little thing to add in here. Menageries have been around for a while, which were the predecessors to zoos. Tower of London housed animals that were considered exotic. But a lot of poor people in Victorian England couldn't go out and see these things. A lot of them had never been out of their neighborhood, off their street. But in the 19th century, traveling menageries, they became a thing. And they would actually bring these dangerous animals that people not only had never seen before, but didn't know what the dangers were, to the people. Yeah, as you would expect, bad stuff happened. And then you had the wealthy who would actually go full on friggin' Tiger King, buy these animals, just as status symbols. And yeah, they'd often get killed by them. Duh. So there were animal poisonings in the Victorian era, even though it wasn't the most common. Microbial poisonings. Okay. I know in the top right corner, I know it's a little small, but that is a Victorian ad from a magazine for tapeworms to help you lose weight. Yes, they sold those. That's fun. The Great Stink. Let's talk about the Great Stink. I love the Great Stink. So, 1858, London, the River Thames. All of the sewage, the human waste, everything, they just dumped it in the river. They didn't care. They didn't know better. You know, they still believed in miasma theory at this point, or bad air. It was disgusting. Not only because this is where they did all their washing, this and that. It's also where they got their drinking water. They literally were drinking crap throughout pretty much most of the 19th century. London was gross. So 1858 comes along. It's July, August, and there's this unprecedented heat wave, which is not something that occurs a lot in England. And the giant cesspool that is the Thames starts to bake, and the stink is just filling the entire city. And these cholera outbreaks, they're happening all over the place. People are dying, and Parliament, they're like, a lot of people are complaining about the smell, and there's a lot of dying, and they keep on asking us if maybe that the smell and the deaths are connected, and they're saying we as Parliament should do something. Do you know what they did? True story. What they did, they coated the walls and curtains of Parliament with chloride of lime, which is a form of powdered bleach, a poison. So they'd rather huff poison, sniff bleach, so that they didn't have to spend the money to redo the sewer system. That's Parliament for you. Well, after a while of this, the civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, he's like, no, this is ridiculous. I have this system that I designed. It's not going to be that expensive to implement. I have a plan, and hear me out. We can pump all the crap away from the city where people live and drink. Well, after a lot of convincing, they implemented his plan. That sewer system remains the basis of the modern London sewer system today, and is said to have saved more lives than any public act in English history. This is from Punch magazine, by the way, this cartoon there, and it is supposed to be a drop of Thames water. You can see all the little monsters and death things in there. Punch magazine is one of my favorites. If you can ever find pictures from Punch magazine, some of the greatest political cartoons of the 19th century in there. All right, let's talk about plants. So I did include where I could find it in here, some of the language of the flowers as well, because they did have the poisons in here too. Start with aconite. Aconite, otherwise known as wolfsbane or monkshood, is a cytotoxin and a neurotoxin, and in the language of the flowers stood for misanthropy, which makes actually a lot of sense, because if you're giving somebody monkshood, you probably don't like them. And yeah. So the effects will occur within minutes with monkshood. Numbing, followed by nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. Then finally, we get to an abnormal heart rhythm, respiratory paralysis, and death. Not a pleasant way to go, but most of these poisonings are not. In Victorian times, it was used in liniments and ointments as an early local anesthetic, because we just talked about the numbing. It was also used in tinctures to slow rapid heartbeat. If you were having a panic attack in Victorian times, doctor's cure was to poison you. Thanks, Doc. Good job. Hemlock. Again, effects occur within minutes. The first effects are key with hemlock because it starts with trembling, dizziness, and weakness. And again, we say we associate hemlock with the Greeks. They loved their hemlock. Their name for it was konas, which is Greek for to whirl. Because if you take hemlock, you feel almost immediately like you just drank an entire bottle of tequila. You're spinning. You can't, whoa, I need to sit down. As you sit down after a couple of minutes, you realize you can't feel your toes and then your ankles. You can't feel, all the paralysis is starting and it's making its way up your lower extremities and then here. So you need to not just sit down, you need to lay down. And it becomes harder to move all the rest because your skeletal muscles are now breaking down as renal failure is occurring and the toxins that are being released from your own kidneys are breaking down your skeletal muscles. And ultimately, it's a pretty nasty death because respiratory and heart failure are what kill you. But you're going to be laying there and pretty uncomfortable for a while before this happens. But you know what? They still used it. Victorians used it for spasms. They used it for rheumatism. They used it to cure rabies, asthma, and other medical issues. And they used it in cosmetics, like perfumes. Mind you, with most plant and metal poisons, they can be absorbed through the skin. So think about that as you put your nice little perfumes on. Oh, and in the language of the flower, appropriately enough, hemlock is "you will cause my death." Yeah, will. Strychnine was discovered in the 19th century coming from the Nux vomica berry. It's a neurotoxin. Very important to know about this one because of the first symptoms. The effects occur within 15 minutes to an hour, and that really depends on how much of a dose you get, how quickly it happens. And we just said it's a neurotoxin. The first symptoms, they're all neurological symptoms. They're almost psychological, one might say, because it starts with agitation, fear, restlessness. You start to feel paranoid. That you're probably not going to associate with a poisoning, but you're going to know something is pretty off because your next symptoms are painful muscle spasms. And what's happening is your jaw is clenching. You can't stop it. Your arms and legs are going rigid like this. And then your back and your neck are arching uncontrollably. This is all happening because of the strychnine poisoning. And then you develop a high fever, followed by liver failure, and then respiratory failure. And because this is all a neurological thing and it's the high fever, you actually experience brain death well before your body actually dies. Strychnine's quite a terrifying poisoning. It was used in medicines to treat palsies, vision problems, hysteria, which we all know is just a catch-all in the 19th century for a woman spoke out of turn. Melancholy, which was just another word for depression. Oh, you're sad? How dare you be sad? Take this poison. And other maladies, my favorite of which, there's a record of it being prescribed, strychnine being prescribed for a rectal prolapse. I don't know what's worse, the treatment or the issue. Like, mind blown. Love it. Cyanide. Okay, let's talk cyanide for a minute. It's found in this is disturbing because it is so commonplace in where it's found. Have you ever had a cherry, a peach, a plum, an apple? Because it's literally in all of those things. You just got to get into the pits, the cores, whatever. It's in the seeds. It's also found in laurel leaves. It's a cytotoxin. It's a general cytotoxin. Throughout your body, it stops your cells from oxygenating. It requires huge doses to really have an effect. But if you get a large enough dose, it pretty much is almost instantaneous in its effects. Weakness, confusion, and headache are your first effects. And then very quickly you move on to nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing, and then you lose consciousness and seizures lead to death by cardiac arrest. And it's all very quick if the dose is large. And that's the key with cyanide. Because it is so quick, it's been the choice of soldiers since it's been discovered as a suicide method. The cyanide capsule. If you're captured, you don't want to be tortured for information, they give you a cyanide capsule to take, and it's almost instant. In the Victorian era, it was also used in paints, dyes, inks, daguerreotype solutions, textile factories, paper making, metal polish, pesticides, and more. Just everywhere. Good old cyanide. Belladonna. Oh, we love our deadly nightshade. It's a neurotoxin. The effects, again, with this one, they start quickly, but you have to have a lot of it for an adult. But most victims are accidental poisonings and they're children because kids are out there. They see these berries, they look good, they taste good, they're sweet. They eat them and kids will die. And they did a lot. So symptoms are dry mouth, flushing, and dilated pupils. If an adult were to have a couple of berries, it would probably end there. It might get as far as the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. If you'd had a lot of it, it would move on to hallucinations, incoordination, tachycardia, coma, and death if you really, really had a lot. It was used in medicine as a pain reliever, as a muscle relaxer, an anti-inflammatory, a cure for whooping cough. I want to stress that. Who got whooping cough? Kids. Who is the most vulnerable to poisoning by deadly nightshade? Kids. Yes, it killed a lot of them. Hay fever and more. But here's the kicker for this one. They also used belladonna in cosmetics. They made belladonna eye drops for women. What it did, belladonna contains two active chemicals. One is atropine, which makes the eyes dilate. And it gave women an appearance of like these sparkling, wide eyes that was very attractive at the time. It also, used over time, caused blurred vision and blindness. However, we have learned how to process these chemicals. We still use atropine in modern optometrist drops. It's the same stuff. We just don't give people belladonna and be like, yeah, have some. The other active chemical, by the way, scopolamine, also still used today. Motion sickness, muscle spasms, anesthetic. But again, we process it. We take the chemical itself in small doses. We don't just throw poison at people like they did back then. Ricin, the last of our poisonous plants on this section. Interesting plant, interesting poison. It comes from the seeds of the castor plant. Very key, seeds of the castor plant. It's a cytotoxin. It can affect all of the cells in your body, but it has a specific tendency to go after the gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, and respiratory systems. It's pretty quick with the effects. Again, it depends on dosage and method of contact. That's what I find the most interesting about ricin. It's different based on how you come into contact with it. Because if you inhale powdered ricin, your symptoms are respiratory and not really all of that like intense until your respiratory failure. Like just coughing, wheezing, oh, like I feel like I have a cold. Until actually, you know what? It sounds like the Rona. It does. It sounds like the Rona. When you inhale ricin, it's just like you got the COVID. Injected, I hope you all know the story of the umbrella gun and the ricin pellet. If not, do yourself a favor, Google it. It causes local injury, swelling. You don't know what the hell happened. You get dehydrated, and then all of a sudden, multiple organ failure. Huh? Go figure. It's the ingestion. It's the ingestion that makes for a fun time. Starts with vomiting and diarrhea, then dehydration. Then you start to hallucinate and get seizures, and then you get the multiple organ failure. So yeah, it's ingestion that's the really fun way to go with ricin. But fun thing, castor oil, which is made from the beans, not the seeds, was, and remains a hugely common product in medicines, in foods, cosmetics, so many other household products. some of you might be old enough, or if you are not, then your parents might be old enough to have actually been given castor oil as a child, as a laxative. In fact, you probably saw it on Tom and Jerry because I remember some episodes of that. And it's the same plant. It's just whether you get it from the seeds or the bean. One, very useful, one, deadly poison. All right, so we haven't quite moved off plants yet, but this is sort of a subsection. The Incredible Medicine Show. Oh boy. So, nicotine. We know nicotine has been around. Well, it was brought over to England in the 16th century. Thank you, Sir Walter Raleigh. It saw its actual first controversy. We tend to think people didn't know nicotine was bad until like the 20th century, but it saw its first controversy in the 19th century. Chemists were doing all their testing. They actually figured out, did you know nicotine's a poison? It kills things. So by the 1860s, there were already doctors publishing articles damning smoking. There is an article here that is too small to read, but I have a quote here. Can we assert of tobacco that what is true of its excessive use is true also in proportionate degree of its moderate and occasional use? In other words, that what is true of a large dose is true in minor degree of a small dose. In short, that is essentially a poison. 1860, they figured this out. So next time your mom says, well, we didn't know any better in the 50s, tell her she's full of shit. Sorry about the cursing, I do that. So yes, nicotine, they were actually learning already that it was poisonous and probably shouldn't be inhaled, but that there was still a division in the medical field, because if you look right above that article, there's an ad for Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes. That's right, there were still some doctors that thought that it had medical purposes and could be used to treat anything from, stomach issues to asthma. Yes, asthma. That's the one that freaking gets me. Oh my God. And while some of the doctors were like, no, you shouldn't inhale that into your lungs, but they still thought there might be a place for it, which is where we get this fun little device on the left side here. That right there was the patent for the smoke enema, because that's how we rolled in the Victorian era. We discover something new, and the first thing we do is figure out, how can we put this up our butts? We did it with electricity. Now we're going to do it with freaking smoke. God, I love Victorians. All right. Opium. Yeah, we all know the pictures of the opium dens and the people go, yes, opium. Derived from the poppy plant brought over from Asia, and it was sold in many forms besides opium throughout the 19th century. Let's see, we've got morphine, laudanum, chloridine. These are the most common ones, and they're all sold over the counter and in many quack tinctures, which caused a huge problem with addiction that we're still fighting the effects of today. Thanks, guys! On the left, we have Dr. Ayer's cherry pectoral, which was in fact a mix of alcohol with 3 grams of morphine. Made you feel great. Then, because we had morphine and opium now, let's step it up a notch. Heroin! As chemists learned to process substances, they concentrated morphine for potency and created heroin! They used it as a painkiller, a cough suppressant, an anti-anxiety medication, and just had fun abusing it. All levels of society, the rich, the poor, it's one thing they had in common. They loved heroin. And here's my favorite part. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a paregoric, but what that was were these soothing syrups. Sold for teething, colic, and other childhood ailments. They were literally nothing but heroin. Yes, they gave infants heroin. You wonder why Victorians said children were seen and not heard? It's because they were stoned. And finally, our wonder drug of the Victorian era, let's talk about cocaine. Derived from the coca plants, It was brought over from South America and used as a wonder drug, which I actually have to admit, it actually was. It was the very first safe anesthesia because local anesthetics were not a thing. 1860s is when cocaine was actually like discovered, processed, whatever, like taken from the coca plant. And after that was isolated, it changed the game for surgery because before that, they had chloroform and ether, which would put you out and you might not ever wake up, which was often the case. So a lot of times people would refuse anesthesia entirely and just go through it and hated it. Wouldn't you? Can you imagine going to the dentist like that or through surgery like that? But people did because the risks of fatal complications from general anesthesia were too bad. But cocaine changed the game. So they used it as a painkiller in anesthesia. They used it as a cure for seasickness. They used it as a cure for hay fever, congestion, and just as a reliable pick me up. Let me tell you, in the Victorian era, people viewed cocaine as casually as we view caffeine. They would go grab a syringe full of cocaine the way we grab a coffee. No big deal. It was so prevalent. Sigmund Freud and other important figures like him openly advocated for it. People would read fictional detective Sherlock Holmes was known for using cocaine in his books, and people were like, yeah, that makes sense. No big deal. No. Somebody said in the chat that they thought it was definitely cocaine that he used in the books. It was just everywhere. It eventually made its way from the pharmacy to the grocery store. That's where we get all these wonderful products. So we've got Coca-Cola, the only one of the Coca wines to survive. There's another brand next to it that did not survive. Yes, the original Coca-Cola recipe was literally nothing but wine and cocaine. So should have stuck with that one, guys. Honestly, I wish they'd bring it back. That middle one, I don't know if you guys can read it, but I would like to try this too because that is Burnett's Extracts, the best hair dressing. Cocaine. It kills dandruff. Who knew? And then we've got cocaine toothache drops marketed for children. And then there's just a plain old straight up bottle of cocaine that you would go to the pharmacist and be like, hey, can I get a bottle of cocaine? And he'd be like, yo, sure, have some cocaine. Here's a bottle of it. Okay? Love it. All right, we are wrapping up with our last couple. I've got like maybe 10 more minutes. And we're now going to talk about the metal poisonings. So we've got antimony. This is like the grossest, okay? So antimony was known as the everlasting pill because it was a tartar emetic. So you guys know what an emetic is? Like Ipecac. Something's wrong with your stomach. You need to butt it out. You take something to make you butt. That's what antimony was used for. The reason it was called the everlasting pill was that it was good for poor families who could buy one small tablet of antimony, use it, like give it to the sick person, they would butt it out, and then this family would dig through the vomit, pick out the pill, wash it off, and keep it until it was fully eroded. They'd use it over and over. So gross. But it's also used in eyeshadow and other cosmetics, so that's nice. And then we have Dr. James fever powder over here, which was little more than antimony and ammonia. It killed the fever by killing you. Quack medicine. Thallium. I'm not even going to go because these are pretty much all cytotoxins, the heavy metals, so I'm not going to list those. But it was medicinally used in antifungal ointments and used in pesticides and insecticides. So we'll just kind of breeze through those two. Lead. This was one. Oh boy. So lead was everywhere. And it was so everywhere that it's kind of still everywhere today. We're still finding it everywhere. It was used in paints, inks, dyes, varnishes, cosmetics, pesticides, fertilizers, topsoil, pipes, plumbing, glassware, gas, everywhere. It was an extremely common byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, and lead poisoning was so commonplace in children. Oh my God. Unfortunately for Victorian children, they only knew how to recognize it by Burton's lines, which is this picture on the right bottom here. That's those bluish lines around the tongue and the gums. But by the time that was visible in children, it was too late. They would already die. The children that didn't show that, they still had developmental issues. They just didn't associate it with the lead and they didn't know better. So lead poisoning everywhere and still today. This is an ad for Hunter's Invisible Medicated Face Powder, which was medicated with lead. Mercury was used in medicine to treat syphilis, in ointments for skin disorders, in tinctures, and my personal favorite, in dental fillings, because then it could chip away and you could actually swallow the mercury. That's great, guys. That's wonderful. It was also used for skin creams and in lipsticks. Again, because right where you want it is like in your mouth. And most famously probably used in hat making, because we all know the Mad Hatter idiom, the Lewis Carroll character, is based on the Danbury Shakes, which is what they called erethism, and they got that name from the Danbury hat makers. All right, probably the most popular poison of the Victorian era, arsenic. This was even more prevalent than lead because it was used literally everywhere. So in medicine, for motion sickness, worms, rheumatism, as an antivenom, eczema, asthma, loss of appetite, circulatory issues, and as an early form of the little blue pill. In cosmetics, they had arsenic shampoo, soap, face powders, lotions, and they sold arsenic wafers to help with the complexion, which it did by breaking the blood vessels in your face. Nice. Household items that had arsenic: furniture, glassware, candles, coal, children's toys, paper, pesticides, topsoil, sheep dips, and other agricultural products that had no regulation. You could buy them by the gallon. Nobody would question it. Dyes, paints, inks, all contained arsenic. The more vibrant the hue, the more arsenic in it. Paris green and Shields green were some of the most popular shades, and they contained copper arsenite. That's what made them so bright and green. Perkins Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper. I know most of you must have read that, where she's like, oh, the wallpaper's making me crazy. Guess what? It was. Yellows and greens contained the most arsenic. Philip Morris, the famous cigarette man, also sold wallpaper at that time and was very famously quoted in denying that his arsenic wallpaper was causing any problems and yelling at the doctors for trying to kill his business. Gee, that's a big surprise. A businessman who refuses to take responsibility for his products killing people. I would never have guessed. And the dye is also used in clothing for the elites, so that absorbed into the skin over time. Here's a selection of nice products. We have Dr. Sim's arsenic complexion wafers, Dr. Mackenzie's arsenical soap, Dr. Mulberry's arsenical lotion. I mean, just everywhere. Food adulteration. The process of contaminating food by adding other substances. They either stretch amounts or just make it look better. We still do that today. We wax the vegetables in the markets, but we regulate it now so that we're not adding poison. This is so gross. So here are your least harmful additives. Now, you got these if you were lucky. You actually wanted these because as gross as they were, they didn't kill you. You'd get water, sand, plaster, chalk, clay, slow ash, leaves, bark, sawdust, husks, cotton, straw, ground bones, bed bugs, maggots, lice, and hair in your food. Yeah, yum, gross. Ugh. Then you'd get shit on not such a good day with alum, copper, rust, lime, Coccolus indicus, and good old-fashioned human excrement. And then if you were really unlucky, you get arsenic, mercury, strychnine, lead, sulfuric acid, boracic acid, which we call today boric acid or borax, and even ground glass all ended up in various food products. The ground glass ended up in the sugar to make it sparkle and look better. Mm. This is another Punch magazine comic. If you please, sir, mother says, will you let her have a quarter-pound of your best tea to kill the rats with, and an ounce of chocolate, as would get rid of the black beetles? Mrs. Beeton is a horrible one. She popularized bottle feeding, but the bottles she designed are known today as murder bottles. Beeton's design had the long, narrow tube, which was already difficult to clean, but on top of that, she also wrote advice columns for mothers saying, oh, you only need to clean the nipple every 2 to 3 weeks. Now, doctors wrote articles condemning her bottle design, her advice, all of that, but she was popular. So, she kept giving the advice and people kept listening to her. So these children started dying. And it's because the bottles were breeding ground for bacteria, in particular bovine TB or pulmonary TB. And it was killing kids. The reason that they didn't know the kids would drink the milk that was contaminated and they didn't know or like turn it away was that Beeton, this dumb woman, also suggested adulterating milk when it was starting to sour by adding borax. And mothers did because she said it was good. This is exactly like men who listen to anti-vaxxers today. Mrs. Beeton was the original anti-vaxxer. All right, I want to go over two two instances that were very famous in bringing legislation, and that'll be the end of it because I'm already kind of running over by like 5 minutes. Okay, the Bradford Lozenge scandal, also known as the Bradford sweets poisoning of 1858. So you got Humbug Billy Hardiker. Humbugs were a very popular candy of the time. And lozenges were another name for just candies. They weren't like throat drops like we think today. They were actually just little hard candies. So Humbug Billy has a sweet stall in central Bradford, and he needs to make a new batch of humbugs. So he asks his supplier, the actual sweets maker, James Appleton, for a new batch. Well, James Appleton agrees. He says he'll make a new batch, but he's running low on his supplies. Appleton does what everybody else does, and he adulterates his food. He uses Daft in his sugar. Daft was a mixture of plaster of Paris with lime. Lovely. But he puts it in his sugar to make it go further. And so one day he's running out when he wants to make this next batch. So he sends a lodger of his who is looking to pick up a few odd jobs to go pick up the Daft for the new batch. Now, this lodger has never done this before. He's just looking to, pick up a few odd jobs. So he's not familiar with any of it. So he goes to the chemist. The chemist that usually does this is not feeling well, and he's got his apprentice filling in. So now you've got a really bad situation. 2 guys that don't know what they're doing, dealing with chemicals. So the apprentice grabs what he thinks is the Daft, but it's the wrong casket. And the lodger who's picking it up, he doesn't recognize the mistake, brings it back. Appleton mixes it in. It's not Daft. It's arsenic. The humbugs that he makes, he can tell they look off, but he's not going to waste all that. So he sells them to Billy at a discount. Billy just puts them out, sells them at his stall. 200 people become ill. 21, most of them children, die. They track it. They figure out it's the humbugs. They go back to Billy. Billy points them to Appleton. This whole story unfolds, and it's the first time people start pushing for legislation and saying, no, it's not cool. Get your crap out of our food. And then we have the chocolate cream killer. She's interesting. Christiana Edmonds. Because I couldn't do a presentation without talking about at least one murderer. So she was born to a life of privilege, but then she was diagnosed with hysteria in her 20s. Now, we know that hysteria was usually just, oh my God, this woman said something. But she was actually crazy. She became obsessed with a married man, Dr. Charles Beard. Beard, he pitied her. So he's just like, oh, pat, pat, pat on the head. It's okay. But he didn't want to do anything or say anything. He just kind of felt bad for her. But then by 1870, she tried for the first time to poison Beard's wife. Well, the wife recovered and they kind of just cut contact with Christiana. So in 1871, she begins purchasing chocolate creams from John Maynard's sweet shop. She had a small dose of strychnine that she bought herself that sparked this plan. So she starts paying young orphan boys, different ones each time, to go buy her more from the chemist. And so she starts stocking up the strychnine and starts dosing the chocolates she had bought. And she'd go back into Maynard's sweet shop to buy more and put the ones that she had dosed back on the shelf secretly. No reason for it. Now, when we had talked about strychnine before, you'll remember that it had to be a pretty large dose. Now, these are small chocolate creams, so she couldn't fit all that much in there. So only one person died, and it was a 4-year-old boy. That doesn't make it better, but at least, it could have been worse. She was always also mailing care packages of these laced chocolates to influential figures. She mailed one to herself to avoid suspicion, and again to Beard's wife, which was her downfall. Because once Beard's wife got the other poisoned chocolates, Beard is like, okay, no, this woman is like dangerous. We need to turn her in. So they turned her into the police. She was arrested, but Beard himself, along with her mother, everybody, like a whole bunch of people testified about her mental health history and that she's a whack job, dude. And so she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of her life in Broadmoor. But again, we're getting more and more pushes toward we need to legislate this crap. So they finally did. I can hear you. I was on my last slide now. Okay, I'm finishing up here. So their first try was in 1819. They tried to pass an act for establishing regulations for the sale of poisonous drugs and for better preventing the mischiefs arising from the inattention of neglect of persons vending the same. Probably didn't pass just because who wants to say that? Their second try, I should say actually it's a third try because the House of Lords tried to pass one in 1851 that just banned women from buying poisons due to several wives murdering husband situations, but that failed miserably, which is hilarious. But their second try, an act to regulate the sale of arsenic, did pass, but was almost unenforceable. So their third try was the most successful of the century, and that was the bill to restrict and regulate the sale of poison in 1857. However, that, while the most successful of the 19th century, was still not the best. And it took until the 20th century a very scary man named Graham Young for any real legislation to occur. So, I mean, that's my presentation. I'm out of time, and I know I kind of went over a little, and I apologize for that. I hope you learned something. And here's my disclaimer. Please don't poison anybody. And, okay. Is okay. I'm free.